The nature of the Supreme Being, transcending anthropomorphic attributes. Across cultures and ages, humans seek to describe the ultimate reality, often calling it God, Brahman, Tao, or the ground of being. We habitually use human categories, love, mercy, justice, to make the divine accessible. This film argues that anthropomorphic language can mislead us, and that we should seek approaches that honor divine transcendence. We will examine the impulse to humanize God, philosophical and theological critiques, and paths beyond anthropomorphism. For philosophy students, listen for distinctions between metaphor, category, and ultimate claims about being. Let us begin. At its core, anthropomorphism is the human tendency to attribute our characteristics, thoughts, emotions, intentions to non-human entities. This cognitive shortcut helps us make sense of the world. When faced with the abstract and unknowable, we instinctively reach for the familiar, ourselves. In religion, this impulse becomes a powerful, almost indispensable tool. It translates a transcendent reality into a relatable form, making the divine intelligible and allowing for a personal relationship where one might otherwise seem impossible. In Christianity, this is vividly illustrated in parables like the prodigal son, which portrays God as a merciful, forgiving father. This is just one facet. The scriptures also depict God as a protective shepherd, a sovereign king, and a righteous judge. The doctrine of the incarnation, where God becomes human in Jesus Christ, represents the most profound expression of this impulse, suggesting the divine can be understood through a human life. Similarly, Hindu traditions are rich with anthropomorphic depictions that provide diverse pathways for devotion, or deities possess complex personalities. Krishna can be a mischievous child, a divine lover, or a wise guide. Shiva is at once the ultimate ascetic and the cosmic dancer whose movements sustain the universe. These multifaceted portrayals allow devotees to connect with the aspect of the divine that most resonates with their spiritual needs, offering a rich tapestry for devotion and moral teaching. In Islamic tradition, the approach is more nuanced. While the core principle of the absolute oneness of God forbids literal comparison, anthropomorphism finds its place through language. The 99 names of God, or use human concepts like Ar-Rahman, the most compassionate, and Al-Adl, the utterly just. These are not literal descriptions but conceptual bridges allowing the mind to grasp aspects of a divine nature that is ultimately beyond comprehension without compromising God's transcendence. Across these contexts, these narratives and names serve a vital purpose. They teach, offering memorable moral exemplars. They comfort, transforming an impersonal force into a personal presence that cares and responds, and they guide, providing a stable ethical reference point. By giving the divine a relatable personality, anthropomorphism builds a foundation for prayer, worship, and a lived daily faith. It makes the ultimate feel intimate, but herein lies the philosophical challenge. This humanizing impulse, so essential for devotion, risks becoming a form of projection. It risks reducing the divine to our own image, imposing human limitations and biases onto a subject that is, by definition, infinite. The philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach argued that theology is ultimately anthropology, that in talking about God, we are only ever talking about an idealized version of ourselves. This is the danger of philosophical idolatry, worshipping a mental construct that is too small and too familiar. Consider divine justice. When we call God just, we often project our own limited models. Human justice involves temporal processes, investigation, evidence, and argument. It is fallible and biased. To apply this model to an omniscient, immutable being is a category error. The analogy, while useful for moral guidance, breaks down under philosophical scrutiny, often revealing more about our own cultural preferences than about a divine reality. The same problem arises with divine love. Human love is intertwined with need, attachment, and change. But if God is defined by classical theism as self-sufficient or possessing and immutable or unchanging, then what can it mean for God to love? Does an unchanging being react with compassion? These analogies, the bedrock of religious feeling, become deeply problematic when treated as literal descriptions of the divine nature. Medieval philosophers were acutely aware of this. Thomas Aquinas proposed that God is pure actuality, fully complete, with no unrealized potential. Humans, in contrast, are a mix of what we are and what we could become. Therefore, any attribute implying change or potentiality cannot apply to God in the same way. Thinkers like Maimonides in the Jewish tradition went further, advocating for a negative theology, that we can only say what God is, to avoid the trap of misleading positive affirmations. So we are left with a delicate balancing act, recognizing the devotional power of anthropomorphism while maintaining philosophical caution. The stories and names that anchor faith are essential bridges, but they are not literal metaphysics. The key is distinguishing metaphor from ontological claim. We must also see how our descriptions reflect cultural biases. A patriarchal society imagines a father god, a monarchy, a king god. The impulse to humanize the divine is natural. The problem arises when the poetry of faith is mistaken for precise description. This critical awareness is not a threat to belief, but an invitation to a more mature understanding. It pushes us to look beyond the human frame, a challenge we will now explore through major philosophical and theological critiques. The history of philosophy is, in many ways, a history of questioning our most basic assumptions. And few assumptions are as deeply embedded in the human psyche as the tendency to imagine the divine in our own image. This is anthropomorphism, and for centuries, thinkers have raised profound critiques against it, urging a more subtle and intellectually rigorous approach to the ultimate questions of existence. The 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza stands as a giant in this tradition. He rejected the idea of a personal monarchical God who exists separate from the universe. Instead, he proposed a radical and elegant vision. God is the single, infinite and self-sufficient substance of which everything is a part. His famous phrase, Deus sive natura, God or nature, encapsulates this idea. For Spinoza, God is not a craftsman who builds the world, God the world in its entirety, the laws of physics, the principles of logic, the unfolding of every event. This is the eternal and necessary expression of the divine nature. From this foundation, Spinoza's critique of an emotional God follows logically. For Spinoza, emotions like love, anger, or jealousy are states of transition. They imply that one is being acted upon by external forces, that one's state of being is changing, moving from less perfection to more, or vice versa. But the divine as the single, all-encompassing substance is by definition perfect, complete, and immutable. It cannot be acted upon by anything because there is nothing outside of it. To say God feels anger at human sin or joy at human praise is to subject the infinite to the finite, to imagine the perfect as changeable and dependent. It is, in Spinoza's view, a profound category error, confusing the nature of the whole with the passions of its parts. A century later, Immanuel Kant deepened this critique from a different angle, focusing not on the nature of God, but on the limits of human reason itself. Kant argued that our minds are not passive windows onto reality. Instead, they actively structure our experience through innate categories of understanding, concepts like time, space, and causality. We don't just perceive a sequence of events, our mind structures them as cause and effect. We don't just see objects, we perceive them as existing in space and time. These categories are the inescapable lens through which we view the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. But, Kant insisted, we can never know if these categories apply to the noumenal world, the realm of things in themselves as they exist beyond our perception. The divine, if it exists, would belong to this noumenal realm. Therefore, when we say God caused the universe, we are applying a human cognitive filter, causality, to a reality that may transcend it entirely. The true nature of the divine remains forever beyond the grasp of our conceptual toolkit. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein brought this critique into the realm of language. He famously warned, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This wasn't a call for ignorance, but for intellectual honesty. Wittgenstein argued that language is a tool that works well within certain contexts, or language games. The language of science is one game, the language of poetry is another. The problem arises when we use the language of one game to try and make factual claims in another. For Wittgenstein, theological language about a transcendent God attempts to speak about what lies outside the boundaries of all possible experience and description. It stretches language beyond its breaking point. To speak of God as a person, or a father, is to use a metaphor. But to treat it as a literal description is to fall into linguistic confusion. These philosophical critiques from the West find powerful echoes in Eastern thought, which has long maintained a sophisticated distinction between different levels of ultimate reality. In the Hindu tradition of Vedanta, this is the difference between Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. Saguna Brahman is the absolute with qualities, gunas. This is God conceived as a personal being, the creator, the sustainer, the merciful Lord. This conception is seen as valid and necessary for the path of devotion, or bhakti yoga, allowing the human heart to form a relationship with the divine. But for the path of knowledge, or jnana yoga, there is a higher, more fundamental truth: Nirguna Brahman. This is the absolute without any qualities or attributes, formless, timeless, and utterly transcendent. It is pure being, consciousness, and bliss beyond all concepts and descriptions. To point the mind toward this ultimate reality, the ancient sages of the Upanishads and later the philosopher Shankaracharya developed a powerful spiritual method. Neti, neti. This phrase translates to not this, not that. It is a process of radical negation. Is Brahman the body? No, not this. Is it the mind? No, not that. Is it the cosmos, the gods, the heavens? Neti, neti. By systematically negating every concept, every attribute, every imaginable thing we might mistake for the ultimate, the mind is quieted. It is emptied of its own projections. This is a method of negation rather than positive description. It doesn't tell us what God, it clears away what God is, leaving an intuitive awareness of the boundless, silent reality that remains when all our labels have fallen away. Faced with these challenges, theologians within the Abrahamic faiths also developed sophisticated linguistic tools to speak about God without falling into simple anthropomorphism. The Christian scholastic Thomas Aquinas, for instance, insisted that we cannot speak of God univocally, that is, using words in the exact same sense as we do for humans. But neither is our language purely equivocal or meaningless. He proposed a middle way, analogical predication. When we say a human is good and God is good, the word good is used by analogy. God's goodness is the infinite, perfect source of the finite, imperfect goodness we see in creation. The term is meaningful, but it points to a reality that infinitely surpasses its human definition. It preserves both the connection to our experience and the profound mystery of the divine. This careful approach is echoed in other traditions. The great Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali argued that the divine names of God, like the Creator or the Merciful, primarily tell us about God's in the world, not God's inner essence. We can witness the effects of creation and mercy, but the essential nature of the being who performs these acts remains transcendent. Similarly, the Jewish philosopher Maimonides championed a rigorous negative theology. He argued that it is far safer and more accurate to say what God is. Every positive attribute we ascribe to God, that God is wise or powerful, risks limiting the divine and introducing multiplicity into God's perfect unity. For Maimonides, the highest knowledge of God is to admit our inability to grasp God's true essence. Across these traditions, the message recurs: divine transcendence resists the confines of literal anthropomorphism. Beyond purely philosophical objections, anthropomorphic language generates profound theological and existential paradoxes, most notably the problem of evil. If God is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving person, why does the world contain such immense and seemingly gratuitous suffering? The philosopher David Hume pressed this point relentlessly. He argued that if we are to infer the character of a creator from the creation, we must conclude that the creator is either not all-powerful, not all-good, or perhaps indifferent to our fate. The existence of a single child dying of cancer, or a fawn perishing in a forest fire, poses a severe challenge to the image of a benevolent, omnipotent divine parent. While theologies have developed defenses, or theodicies, they often struggle to account for the sheer scale and arbitrary nature of suffering, pushing many to question the simple anthropomorphic picture of God that created the problem in the first place. These critiques have led thinkers to propose alternative models of divinity that move beyond the personalistic framework. We've seen Spinoza's pantheism, where God is nature itself, and the problem of evil dissolves into natural process. Another powerful alternative is process theology, inspired by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead imagines God not as a static, omnipotent ruler, but as the creative, relational soul of a dynamic, evolving universe. In this view, God is not coercive but persuasive, luring the world toward greater beauty and complexity. Crucially, this God is not immune to suffering. God is dipolar, experiencing the entire sweep of cosmic becoming, sharing in the world's pain as well as its joy. God is the fellow sufferer who understands, a model that reframes the problem of evil by radically redefining divine power. Other models, like panentheism, suggest the universe is God, but God is also more than the universe, preserving both immanence and transcendence. Contemporary science, with its focus on emergence, complexity, and relational systems, invites us to think of divinity in these more systemic, non-anthropomorphic terms. The universe as described by physics and biology does not operate like a human king, but like an intricate, self-organizing web of relationships and emergent laws. This perspective encourages us to imagine the divine not as a being, but perhaps as being itself, the ground from which all things arise, the creative principle embedded within the cosmos, or the fundamental consciousness in which the universe unfolds. Ultimately, these philosophical and theological critiques are not simply exercises in intellectual demolition. They are invitations to humility and maturity. They challenge us to recognize the difference between the symbol and the reality, the map and the territory. They urge us to be precise with our metaphorical language and to remain aware of its limits. By questioning the simple inherited picture of a human-like God, these traditions of thought push us toward a more profound, more mysterious, and perhaps more authentic encounter with the ultimate nature of reality, whatever that may be. Having confronted the profound limitations and inherent dangers of projecting our own image onto the ultimate, we arrive at a critical juncture. The question is no longer we should move beyond literal anthropomorphism, but how do we speak about the ineffable without reducing it to a mere caricature of ourselves? How do we cultivate a relationship with a reality that defies our neat, human-centric categories? Fortunately, the world's philosophical and theological traditions have grappled with this very problem for millennia. They offer us not a single definitive answer, but a portfolio of sophisticated strategies, 4 of which we will explore as safer, more intellectually honest, and spiritually expansive paths forward. Our first approach is the way of negation, known in the West as apophatic theology, or negative theology. Its core principle is one of profound intellectual humility. We cannot say what God, because any positive description we use, wise, powerful, loving, is drawn from our finite created experience, and thus falls infinitely short of the reality it seeks to describe. Instead, we can only state what God is. This method seeks to clear away our limited concepts to make space for a reality that transcends them. It preserves the radical otherness, the transcendence of the divine. We find this powerfully expressed in the Hindu Upanishads with the phrase, neti, neti, not this, not that. The ultimate reality, Brahman, is not the body, not the mind, not our thoughts, not anything that can be perceived or conceived. Similarly, the medieval Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, in his, argued that every positive attribute we ascribe to God actually detracts from his unity and perfection, inadvertently likening him to created beings. For Maimonides, the highest knowledge of God is the recognition of our inability to grasp his true essence. This path of negation carves out a sacred silence, a space of unknowing, where the divine can be encountered beyond the confines of language. If the first path clears the ground through negation, our second approach attempts to build upon it with carefully chosen language. This is the way of analogy, or analogical predication. It forges a middle path between two extremes. On one hand is univocal language, which assumes a word like love means the exact same thing when applied to a human and to God, a position that leads directly to anthropomorphism. On the other hand is equivocal language, which claims the word has a completely different and unrelated meaning, leaving us in total silence. Analogy suggests that while the words are not the same, they are related. Human goodness is a distant, faint echo of a divine goodness, which is its source. The Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas was the master of this approach. He taught that when we say God is good, we are not defining God. Rather, we are using the highest value we know, goodness, and acknowledging that whatever God is, it is the source and perfection of that quality in a way that we cannot comprehend. Our word love points toward a divine reality, like a finger pointing at the moon. The finger is not the moon, and to mistake it as such is an error, but it correctly directs our gaze. This analogical path allows us to use our language meaningfully, but it comes with a crucial warning label. We must always remain aware of the immense qualitative gap between our concepts and the divine reality they signify. The third path moves beyond philosophical discourse into the realm of direct, transformative experience, mystical contemplation. Mystics across traditions agree that the ultimate reality cannot be grasped by the rational mind alone. Reason builds categories, but the divine shatters them. Therefore, mystics use language not to define but to evoke. They employ paradox, poetry, and metaphor to short-circuit the analytical intellect and open the heart to a unitive perception. This is not an anti-intellectual stance but a trans-intellectual one, suggesting that reason can only take us so far on the journey. The Sufi poet Rumi famously invites us, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field, I'll meet you there." This field is a state of consciousness beyond the dualistic judgments of the ego mind, a space of pure being. Similarly, the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart spoke of the need to let go of God to find God, to release our cherished concepts of a personal, nameable God in order to experience the deeper, unnameable Godhead, the silent desert of being from which all things arise. This path emphasizes inner transformation over doctrinal correctness. Our fourth approach broadens our perspective by looking to other cultures, which often have non-anthropomorphic thinking built into their very foundations. For instance, the central Buddhist concept of shunyata, or emptiness, teaches that nothing possesses a fixed, independent, separate self, including the ultimate nature of reality. This directly dismantles the idea of a standalone, person-like God. Similarly, Taoism begins with the famous warning, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." The ultimate principle is like an uncarved block, a flowing watercourse, a dynamic, impersonal process, not a cosmic monarch. These perspectives are not merely exotic alternatives, they are powerful correctives, encouraging us to question the cultural baggage embedded in our own default assumptions about the divine. So, what are the practical implications of adopting these more nuanced approaches? The first and most immediate is a profound sense of intellectual and spiritual humility. To move beyond literalism is to embrace what philosophers call epistemic humility, the sober recognition that our finite minds cannot possibly contain the infinite. We acknowledge that our most cherished theological concepts are not photographs of reality, but provisional maps. This posture is the greatest defense against dogmatic certainty and the violence that too often follows in its wake. This humility naturally fosters a spirit of genuine inclusivity. If we accept that our tradition offers one analogical, partial perspective, we become open to the wisdom in others. We can see different religions not as competing truth claims, but as different fingers pointing toward the same moon. The famous parable of the blind men and the elephant becomes our guide. One touches the trunk and calls it a snake, another the leg and calls it a tree. None are entirely wrong, but all are incomplete. Interfaith dialogue then shifts from debate to a collaborative sharing of insights into the one transcendent reality that grounds us all. Third, this shift aligns our spiritual thinking with the most profound insights of the modern world. The anthropomorphic model of a king on a throne is a product of a pre-scientific, hierarchical worldview. Today, ecology and systems thinking reveal a world built on interconnected webs and emergent networks. Quantum physics unveils a reality that is probabilistic, entangled, and defies common sense. A non-anthropomorphic divine conceived as the ground of being, the principle of interconnectedness, or the information field underlying the cosmos, is far more compatible with this new understanding than a simple projection of human personality. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there are powerful ethical consequences. When God is imagined as a powerful person, it becomes tempting to instrumentalize him, to try and bargain with him, to use prayer as a cosmic vending machine, or to claim him as an ally for our own political or military causes. Moving beyond anthropomorphism dismantles this transactional relationship. If the divine is understood as the sacred web of life itself, our ethical focus shifts from appeasing a distant ruler to accepting our intimate responsibility creation. Our duty is to care for the web, to promote justice and flourishing, not for a future reward but because in doing so, we are honoring the sacred nature of reality itself. In sum, the human impulse to attribute our own highest qualities, love, mercy, justice, to the Supreme Being is a natural, perhaps even necessary starting point. It provides an accessible entry into spiritual life, but it is a starting point we are called to move beyond. As we have seen, the world's great philosophical and theological traditions do not endorse a naive literalism. Instead, they consistently urge caution, subtlety, and sophistication, offering us a rich toolkit of alternatives to refine our understanding. The journey beyond anthropomorphism is a mark of intellectual and spiritual maturity. It is not a loss of faith, but a deepening of it. The reward is immense: a more resilient humility, a clearer and more profound theology, a genuine openness to interfaith wisdom, and a more robust ethical framework for our interconnected world. Ultimately, this path does not lead to a cold, abstract emptiness. It invites us into a deeper and more authentic form of worship. A silent reverence for the awesome, beautiful and terrifying mystery that both transcends and sustains us, a reality that will forever elude our concepts and yet forever call us home. This exploration leaves us with vital questions for our own reflection. At what point does a helpful pedagogical metaphor become a harmful idol? How can we use the language of modern science, from cosmology to neuroscience, to forge new, more adequate metaphors for the divine? And what are the political and social consequences of clinging to a literal anthropomorphic God in our complex, pluralistic world? Thank you. References and sources for further study are available in the description below.